Robert and the Attack of the Giant Tarantula, Chapter 9. The Worst Feeling in the World. On Saturday morning, Lester was outside his house waiting when Robert and his mother drove up. He slid into the back seat next to the rabbit cage. Robert was buckled into the front passenger seat. Neither of them said a word. Robert looked in the rear view mirror and saw Lester take a carrot from his jacket and feed it to Buster. Lester really loved those rabbits. Robert's mom drove to the animal shelter and parked. "I'll come in with you," she said. They got out of the car. Lester carried the cage. Robert walked next to him. Inside, they went up to a woman at the front desk. "We have some rabbits," Lester said. "To adopt," added Robert. The woman smiled. "Of course," she said. She picked up a phone and punched some buttons. "We need an attendant," she said. Soon a young woman in a white coat came out. "Hi," she said. She looked in the cage. "Oh, how sweet." With one final goodbye, they left the rabbits with the attendant. Lester ran out to the car. Robert couldn't remember ever feeling worse than he did at that moment. On the way home, Robert heard a sniffle. Then he realized it was coming from him. The weekend was long, with the rabbits gone from Robert's room. Flo and Billy seemed sad, and Fuzzy hardly moved. Lester called once, just to talk. He choked up when he mentioned Buster's name. Robert kept busy working on his diorama of a recycling center. He glued a toy car tire onto a pile of others. He made tiny bundles of newspapers, cut from real newspapers, and tied them with thread. He tried not to think about Buster and the baby bunnies at the animal shelter, but the more he tried not to think of them, the more he did. Charlie saw him working on his diorama. He came into Robert's room to look at it. "Cool," he said. Robert had just glued 3 soda cans in place. He had painted them blue and marked them aluminum, glass, and plastic, just like the ones at the River Edge Recycling Center. "You forgot the rats," said Charlie. "Huh?" "You need rats in it," Charlie told him, "to be more realistic." "I don't think so," Robert mumbled. He knew better than to listen to his brother. Once Charlie had talked Robert into doing an oral report about the toilet, and everyone laughed at him. By Sunday night, Robert's diorama was almost done. He went to bed early. He was tired from not thinking about rabbits. Chapter 10. The Visitor. On Monday, Robert brought his diorama to school. It was almost done, but he still had to paint in the background. Suzanne Lee Rogers bounced up to Mrs. Berthnall's desk. "My diorama is finished," she said. "Thank you, Suzanne Lee," said Mrs. Berthnall. "You may put your diorama on the windowsill." It was the first one completed. Suzanne Lee was always the first and the best and the smartest in everything. The rest of the morning passed slowly. In the afternoon, while they were working on math problems, there was a knock on the door. Mrs. Berthnall opened the door and a man came in. He carried a red cage with the name Bonnie painted on the side. In his other hand, he carried a shopping bag. He gave Mrs. Berthnall a note. "Children, this is Mr. Dennis," Mrs. Berthnall announced. "Mr. Dennis trains animals. Say hello to Mr. Dennis, class." "Hello, Mr. Dennis," said the children. "Hello," he said. "I brought my sidekick, Bonnie, with me." Robert's eyes opened wide as Mr. Dennis took a rabbit out of the cage. It was big and white and had a torn ear, just like Buster. "Some of you guys may recognize Bonnie," said Mr. Dennis. "She's on TV." I know," said Melissa Thurm. "She's the Easter Bunny." "Yes, she's the Easter Bunny in those commercial for Banbury's chocolates." Robert gasped. "It's Buster," he said. "I have a story to tell you about Bonnie." Mr. Dennis went on. "We filmed a commercial not far from here. Bonnie got out of her cage and disappeared. I called everyone I could think of, but Bonnie was gone and we had to leave." "That's so sad," said Vanessa Nicolini. "Yes," said Mr. Dennis. "I thought I would never see Bonnie again. Then, this morning, I got a call from someone at Banbury's Chocolates. They said someone was trying to reach me. He had a rabbit and wondered if it could be Bonnie." Robert turned to Lester, but Lester had already gone up to the front of the room. He looked at the rabbit in the eyes and cried, "Buster!" "Are you Lester or Robert?" asked Mr. Dennis. "I'm Lester," said Lester. "Hey, how did you know my name?" Mr. Dennis laughed. Robert got up too. "I'm Robert," he said, looking in the cage. Snuggled together were 6 little bunnies. The other children came up to pet Bonnie and look at the babies. "How did you find us?" asked Robert. "Your mother told me that Lester found Bonnie and that the 2 of you took care of her. She also told me where I could find Bonnie and your school so I could come and say thank you." "You're keeping the babies too?" Robert asked. "Yes, unless you'd like to have one," said Mr. Dennis. "No, thank you," said Robert. "I was just wondering." "I have treats for everyone," said Mr. Dennis, handing Robert the shopping bag. "Why don't you and Lester hand them out?" Robert and Lester gave a Banbury's chocolate rabbit to each of their classmates. Mrs. Berthnall got one too. "What do you say, class?" asked Mrs. Berthnall. "Thank you, Mr. Dennis," the class said. "Mr. Dennis, will you tell us how you train animals?" asked Suzanne Lee. "I'd be glad to," Mr. Dennis answered. He turned to Mrs. Berthnall. "They're smart, aren't they?" he said. "They're the best class in the whole world," Mrs. Berthnall said. As Mr. Dennis talked, Robert nibbled at the ears of his chocolate rabbit. He noticed Paul had started at the rabbit's feet. He turned around. Lester had the whole head of his rabbit stuffed in his mouth. Things were definitely back to normal. As Mr. Dennis talked, Robert let his thoughts wander. Someday he and Paul could become animal trainers like Mr. Dennis. They could start with Fuzzy or with Flo and Billy. He wondered if anyone had ever trained a tarantula to fetch. The end. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know in the comments below what books you'd like for me to read next. As always, thank you for listening.